From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The Texas House gets set for a big vote on Governor Greg Abbott's school choice proposal as Democrats in Illinois fail to save a scholarship program there for low-income students. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, editorial board member Colin Levy and columnist Kim Strassel. Let's start in Illinois, where the state legislature last week failed to reauthorize an Invest in Kids program, a scholarship program. And Colin, my understanding is that that's now going to sunset. Can you give listeners a reminder of what the Invest in Kids program is, how it works, and how this political debate played out there in Illinois?
Sure. This is really a tragedy, Kyle, what's happened here. The Invest in Kids scholarship program was started by Governor Bruce Rauner, and it offered a 75% state tax credit for donations to allow kids to go to private schools here in Illinois. And it was wildly popular. It was currently serving about 9,600 kids who are currently enrolled in private schools. And it's had between 20 and 30,000 children also on the waiting list. So everyone's been fighting pretty hard to keep this. Obviously, the children, many of the scholarship granting organizations have been fighting very hard to keep these kids in educational options that were really serving their needs. But it died basically because Democrats in the state legislature are too afraid of the teachers' unions to act in a way that was contrary to their interests here. And Governor Pritzker, although he's said along the way that he would sign anything that came to his desk, he's offered sort of lukewarm support for the program. He really wasn't willing to fight for it. He wasn't willing to pick up the phone and call lawmakers and say, this is important. So this is the first death of a major school choice program in the country. And it didn't happen because of litigation. It just happened because of legislative inaction. So it's a real shame.
Kim, what do you make of this fight? And will any Democrats pay any political price for it? So just to pick out a line from one of the Journal's recent editorials on this, there were Democrats who were calling this a voucher program that was part of taking money out of the public schools. But the Invest in Kids program was about $50 million a year. And since it launched, state spending on public schools has gone up by about $2 billion. And at the same time, enrollment in state public schools are declining. So more money to educate fewer children. Kim, I can't understand why even a Democratic governor like J.B. Pritzker couldn't look at this list of 10,000 kids, low-income kids, because this is a program that is directed at people with incomes under a certain threshold of the poverty line, and see a political benefit in trying to save this scholarship program.
Yeah, you can't understand, and neither can parents. And that will answer your question about whether or not Democrats may pay a political price for this. As we all know, and we've talked about on this show, the COVID situation and the lockdowns that followed and the horrible damage that was done to schools have woken many parents to the problems with public education. And they already knew, but now they are really engaged. It's remarkable to go back to Colin's point about how this is now the first state to kill school choice. It isn't just that dishonor, but the fact that Illinois is moving in the complete opposite direction of where most states in the country are headed. I mean, we now, just in the 2023 legislative session, more than 8 states passed universal school choice. And that's being driven by the demands of parents who have stepped up to see changes on their school boards, demand changes with curriculum, demand that their legislators step up and support more choice for them. As you note, this is also a program for low-income kids in Chicago, 20,000 kids on the wait list, very popular. Those parents are going to remember this. And, you know, we've already seen a lot of stories coming out about a lot of minority voters, lower income voters, rethinking their longtime allegiance to the Democratic Party, deciding that they're going to vote for other candidates that suggest they have their particular interests more in mind. And I think that this is just a very bad look for the Democratic Party because it's being driven by their special interests and their elites, not by the rank and file in their party base that is generally supportive of school choice.
And there is some evidence, I think, in other states that there are school choice voters The one that I think of particularly is in Florida, where Governor Ron DeSantis was originally elected by a very narrow margin. And if you look at the exit polls, there have been analysts down there who have suggested that he got a higher share of minority women voters than you might expect, out of line with minority men voters, for example. And one interpretation of that is it was school choice moms, because he was running against a Democratic nominee who had pledged to roll back Florida's school choice programs. Colin, maybe one answer on the political question is that this was still a pretty small program in Illinois, only about 10,000 students benefiting from it. And so maybe Pritzker and the Democrats are thinking, even if some of those people turn into school choice voters, there are not going to be enough of them to make a difference, and better to act now before this program grows into something more like Florida, where those voters really could start to swing elections. But the other question I have now is, what is going to happen to this program? My understanding is that there is going to be some sort of effort to try to keep scholarships going for those students using private donations. But do you think that that will have some success, particularly without the kind of tax credit that the state had been offering in support of it?
Right. So on your first point, I think cynically there may be some element of truth in that, but it's also worth remembering, Kyle, that people did know this program was out here, and citizens in Illinois are very aware that only about 35% of children in the state are proficient in reading. I mean, those are just dismal numbers. And I think that's why you've seen, in previous polls, there was an Illinois Policy Institute poll a few months ago that 59% of Democrats supported the program. And we also know that there's very strong support for it in the minority communities. I think talking about your present point, there's definitely a push for gathering as much money as possible right now to shore up the scholarships once the program expires. There's going to be a drive to get wealthy donors to cover the shortfall now that the tax credit is going to sunset, and to continue giving. But I think the loss of that 75% tax credit that the program offered is really going to damage the donations that come from the smaller dollar donors who can't afford to give the money unless they have the tax credit. I think another interesting thing, though, here, Kyle, is at a more granular level. Private schools, my reporting shows, are also increasing their fundraising as best they can to try to get enough money to cover the scholarship kids that they currently have enrolled, so that they don't get kicked out at the end of the year. So I think there's a lot of effort to support these kids who have really gotten caught in this cynical political trap.
Meantime, Kim, you mentioned those states that were passing universal school choice. And the question now in the Texas legislature is whether Texas will join those states. Governor Greg Abbott has been pushing hard for this for months, and a recent breakthrough earlier this month was a deal with House Speaker Dade Phelan. And according to the terms of that deal negotiated with the governor, there would be educational savings accounts open to any Texas student. They'd get about $10,500 put into those that they could use for education expenses if they wanted to opt out of the local government school. And then that provision would be tied with raises for public teachers, more money for the public schools, and so forth. But Kim, notable that the most recent reporting here today by the Houston Chronicle, it says more than a dozen Republicans signed on to an amendment Friday to block school vouchers ahead of a key vote in the Texas House, likely dooming Governor Greg Abbott's priority policy. And so, Kim, we're still waiting on the breaking news of what is going to happen in the Texas legislature, but notable for a particularly red state, a state that prides itself on being a bastion of conservative policy ideas, falling way behind not only Florida, but other states that are red and reddish and a little bit purple.
School choice in Texas has become the school choice battle of the year. Watching this, and I give Texas Governor Greg Abbott enormous credit for not giving up on this. This is now the fourth special session that he has called, dragging his lawmakers back to try to get this priority across. I think it's worth noting why this is having trouble in a red state. And it's a story that was little noticed a couple of years ago, but now really has become front and center because of the prevalence of these school choice fights these days, which is that in red states for too long, part of the opposition to these programs has not just been Democrats, but rural Republicans. And I can speak to this. I live in a rural area myself, not in Texas, but Often rural area schools function a little bit better, in part because communities are smaller. There's more interaction between teachers and parents. There's a little bit more oversight and accountability in the school systems. So a lot of rural parents feel fairly satisfied with their schools. But more importantly, it's simply the case that there aren't as many private and parochial options in lesser populated areas of big states. So if you look at Texas, for instance, there's about 1,200 private schools. Only about 55 of them are located in counties that have fewer than 50,000 people. And so you've seen this enormous pushback from rural Republican legislators who make the same argument the Democrats make, that, well, this is just going to divert funds away from a public school system that we're happy with. Now, I reject that logic. I think it's kind of a chicken and an egg argument. I think the fact that there isn't much school choice in these areas means that parents aren't aware of how much better things could be if there were. I can speak to that as well, too. In my rural area, we actually have a lot of school choice, and it's an incredibly popular thing. And people really love it because they now know how many options that they have. But none of that changes the current dynamic, which is, you say that you only need 10 Republicans to join with Democrats in the House to strip that out. As you noted, more than a dozen signed on to this potential amendment to do so. I would note that that is down. Earlier this year, there was a budget amendment to prohibit public funds for this program, a voucher program, that was signed on to by 24 House Republicans. So there's a fewer number these days that are doing this. But, Abbott may yet have to come out and threaten to play in primaries, which is something he said he would do if he cannot push members of his own party to go along with this initiative.